Hi, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Tamaya Cox-Ture, and I am the Executive Director of the ACLU of Oklahoma. And I'm so happy that you're joining us today to talk about our legislative session. Before we get started, we want to know who we're talking to. So if you are on Facebook Live or if you're through our Zoom link, please share through the chat your name, your pronouns, where you're located, and why you're here. We really want this to be as interactive as possible. We know that unfortunately, because of COVID still, that we can't do this in person, but we just want to know where you are and, and where you're from. Again, I'm Tamaya Cox-Ture. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm really excited that you joined us today. We also want to make sure, as we try to get this as interactive as possible, we hope that you will use our question and answer function or through the chat function if you have any questions throughout the time. So again, please, questions that you have during the presentation or that kind of come up, put them in the chat or the Q&A portion. The session was unlike any session that we've probably seen in a long time. I'm very fortunate that I've been able to be involved in Oklahoma City or Oklahoma policy for a long time. I've been a registered lobbyist for almost 15 years now. And I will be very honest, this session has been one of the toughest that I've seen. You may remember we had a similar event not too long ago, kind of mid-session, where we were talking about bills that were kind of making their way and progressing their way through. So this really is a continuation from that, an opportunity to talk about the bills that have made their way, have either been that have been signed into law or are currently effective or will be effective coming up. And there are a few bills that thankfully did not make their way, but because of the way session is, it's very possible they could come back up. So this is an opportunity, education opportunity for sure, but we also want to keep you in the mindset that there's still work to be done and we still have work to do, and we can only do that work through your help. Again, please make sure that you use your question and the Q&A part or the chat function during this time. We have some of our great esteemed colleagues and staff to kind of help lead us through the process. But we also recognize that it's a privilege to be in the work that we are. So if for any reason you need clarification or more information, please let us know. You've heard a little bit, I think when you came on, you may have heard a little bit about some of the music that you heard when you were coming on. Want you also to go to Spotify and like our playlist. This is actually our Pride playlist that we're really proud of. So if you need something upbeat to get you through the rest of this month, please go to Spotify and like our playlist and enjoy with us. And with that said, I am going to actually kick it to our development director, Lisa, to really talk to you a little bit about kind of our development work, as well as how you can continue to support our organization.
Thank you so much, Tamaya. Lisa Pizzeri, she, her Director of Development here for the ACLU of Oklahoma. Such a privilege to work with these folks and to support this organization. And speaking of supporting this organization, I'm dropping in the chat a link to the different ways that you can support us through both the union and through the foundation. This is a link on our website. We cannot do this tremendous amount of work without your support. And so we thank you so much, and we hope you'll continue to be involved with us. Without further ado, there is so much to cover from this legislative session. I'd like to introduce Nicole McAfee, our policy director. She's going to talk with us about what the heck happened, as this session is called. So, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm going to do my best to talk about what the heck happened as quickly as we can and dive into the things that interest y'all. As Lisa said, my name is Nicole McAfee. My pronouns are she, they. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the affiliate, and I'm going to ask you to please excuse my congestion. I am deep within allergy season. So if you need me to speak up or clarify something, feel free to drop that in the chat and I will do my best there. Tamaya mentioned that this was a session unlike any other, at least in recent memory. As has been a trend over the last several years, we saw more bills filed than ever before. We also saw more bills passed than ever before, while the legislature is there for the same amount of time, which means that as that happens, less time is spent on some really critical pieces of legislation that impact our rights and liberties, especially given the volume of those bills this year. Um, so what we're going to do today is go through just a bit of the overview of session as a whole, talk about a few of the wins where we had those, celebrating both the good things that happened and the bills we stopped is certainly important. We're going to talk a little bit about bills attacking the 2S LGBTQ plus community, some of the AntiFreedom bills that really moved in large volume through this session, some of the attacks on immigrant communities in Oklahoma, um, attacks on access to abortion care, what moved in the criminal legal space, which was largely not reform, a little bit about critical race theory, and then some of what's next. So I know that is a lot. It's an ambitious agenda. I'm going to do my best to give you some good top line summaries of what happened in each of these spaces and hope that as you have questions, you will drop them in the chat, and that this will very much be sort of a first conversation of debriefing all of the things that happened and figuring out how and what we do next. So this session, there were 3,019 bills authored, 598 ultimately passed. Of those, 570 were authored in their original form by a Republican, 28 authored by a Democrat. We saw less bipartisan legislation this year than we have ever before. It was pretty clear from the get-go that carceral reform and criminal legal reform were not key priorities. They weren't named in the state of the state or sort of as priorities from either majority caucus. And we really saw that play out in the legislative session. Um, and I think another key piece of this is that ultimately we saw sort of bill shucking as a norm. So this process where bills are moving through the legislature as usual, and at sort of a last minute, at a pivotal point, the entire nature of the bill is changed. And while that's something that's largely been frowned upon, we saw it happen in several major cases this session. So it definitely gives us something to keep an eye on in the future. I think that just sort of other key thing of note here is that a lot of our priorities this session were driven by nationwide trends. So we saw a lot of these bills talked about by legislators as something requested from their constituents, when ultimately they were bills that were copied and pasted from nationwide orgs pushing these same priorities in states across the country. And as we see these sort of more nationwide trends meant to push things to the courts, meant to attack rights and liberties, it means that we're seeing things that are further and further from the interest of Oklahomans. But I will start by, thank you, Casty, for the slideshow assist there, by talking a little bit about some of the wins, because I think that those are critical. We don't celebrate those enough, and they certainly did happen. I think that the biggest of note is the passage of House Bill 1795. This bill ultimately was sort of the most significant reform impacting the criminal legal system that moved this session. Based on data sort of analyzed in the last 2 years, so 2019, 2020, about 17,000 Oklahomans faced license suspensions for non-driving misdemeanor drug possession cases. That doesn't begin to calculate in the number of people who face driver's license revocations for fines and fees or other sort of court-related penalties not related to driving. What House Bill 1795 does in its final form is it ends several of these non-driving offense suspensions, and it provides driving access for people who lose their license annually for failure to pay. We know that access to a license and to the ability to drive is key for reentry success for jobs in most parts of Oklahoma, as well as for making it to court appearances and court mandated appearances. So this takes effect this November, and Representative Miller and Senator David certainly did an incredible job in making sure that this wasn't lost sort of as a priority this session. The second sort of major win in the space that I think it is worth noting is expansion of medical parole. The ACLU of Oklahoma really led in the effort as soon as we learned about COVID-19 to ensure that as many people as possible in Oklahoma prisons had access to medical parole, with the hope that people who were medically vulnerable could have options for release. And what we saw was a really disappointing number of people put forward on a list, ultimately less than 15. Um, and a lot of that was because DOC sort of named that they saw barriers to the process, that they didn't believe they could make that list any broader. And so Senate Bill 320 really outlines some of those parameters to make sure that hopefully going forward, the people that need access to medical parole have that option. A few of the other wins, Senate Bill 44, which ensures people that were detained by law enforcement during a time they were supposed to be in a court don't receive warrants or fines for their inability to appear. That seems common sense enough, but this is legislation that has been several years in the making to passage. Senate Bill 511 that passed with emergency, which decriminalized some critical harm reduction work happening on the ground in the state. We finally saw the passage of Senate Bill 172, Ida's law, which really focuses on response to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks. We also saw the passage of the Sarah Stitt Act, House Bill 1679, which really does some key paperwork to make sure that as people are leaving Oklahoma prisons, they have documents that they need necessary for housing, employment, uh, access to healthcare, all of the sort of groundwork for successful reentry. So all of those wins definitely worth celebrating. Not as many or as large as we would like to see, but really grateful for each of the legislators and all of the constituents who took part in making those happen. Now we'll talk about some of the legislation aimed at doing harm. Starting with attacks on the 2S LGBTQ plus community. We really saw these in two key areas, starting in the House in House Bill 1888, which then was language sort of shucked into Senate Bill 627. We saw attempts to really limit training or counseling for state entities around gender or sexual diversity. We also then saw sort of a bigger push from the Senate, which really sought to attack transgender youth, especially. The bill that moved the furthest there was Senate Bill 2, also a bill that was shucked. So it was moved through the Senate with an entirely different purpose. And then sort of on the committee deadline had that language changed in the House to move some language that hadn't been heard in the Senate from the get-go. And so this bill, especially as part of a larger piece of sort of those national trends of attack. So this year alone, we saw more bills passed attacking transgender folks than we had in the last decade combined in state legislatures. Because of a really community-driven effort that all of you took part in, we stopped that from happening here in Oklahoma. But we're not quite off the hook yet. As Tamaya mentioned at the beginning, any of this legislation that is currently dormant is eligible to be heard when they come back next session. So as we think about sort of debriefing what happened and looking to what's next, a big part of that is going to be how we have conversations to try to disrupt some of these harms from continuing in this next legislative session. The other just note I have here and bills that weren't heard, but were introduced in the Senate, that is also sort of part of this national trend is healthcare bans. So banning affirming healthcare for transgender youth. Um, and as we think about next session and trying to make sure that this legislation doesn't move, we're very much keeping an eye on those bills as well, even though they weren't heard this session. Um, Anti-freedom bills. This is legislation that has been talked about a lot. And unfortunately, that has gotten Oklahoma a lot of bad news coverage as we seem to both hear the largest number of these bills and pass most of them. Um, those include House Bill 2095, which uses sort of the statute designed to tackle organized crime, really sort of mob era statute to target protesters and protest organizers. Um, we also saw the passage of House Bill 1643, a bill that is really aimed at criminalizing people engaged in police accountability work. Um, I think that the discussions that we will continue to have ahead of these effective dates is sort of the gaps in how legislators presented these bills and what they were going to do versus what they actually say and are going to do. Um, but we are always concerned, even if the promises were sort of more harmful than the reality of what it means for legislation like this to chill speech and make people think twice about um, things that are very much within their rights. Um, the anti-freedom bills were not limited to those two. We also saw House Bill 1674, which is sort of one of the most egregious of these bills passed nationwide, part of this trend of what a lot of folks refer to as hit and kill bills. This legislation both criminalizes folks for being unlawfully in a roadway, while also removing mechanisms for criminal or civil liability for a driver who injures or kills protesters. Again, with parameters here, sort of about the intention there and a sense of fear when fleeing, but things that put folks in danger and make folks fearful of going out to protest. And so we're certainly still having conversations about the realities and harms of this legislation. Um, the other of these bills that I wanted to lift up was Senate Bill 403, which was really targeted at sort of Oklahoma County specifically, in that it criminalizes sort of organizing tactics we've seen utilized that are disruptive on purpose to make a point in public meetings. So while these were protections extended to the state legislature and state bodies before, um, this legislation with emergency extended these to municipal council meetings, to meetings of jail trusts and county commission meetings. So again, we are keeping an eye very much on what the impacts of these are on the ground. Um, I think that for folks doing work in immigrant communities, especially with folks who may not have papers, it is no surprise that the legislature regularly launches attacks in this space, and that they get a little bit less airtime than some of the other bills, even though they're very much as harmful, if not more so. We saw passage of two of these this session. One, House Bill 2774, a bill that really looked to sort of preempt some possibility that ICE may be removed from the Oklahoma County Jail. This bill just takes away that local decision-making power, and really subjects everyone to the harms of ICE detainers. Um, so that legislation passed. The other bill in this space that passed is House Bill 2030. Um, this bill would require students ahead of graduation to pass a state mandated naturalization test. Um, this adds another piece of testing, another piece of curriculum um, that teachers have, no need for in sort of proving competency. It's another barrier to graduation for students. And it also minimizes all of the real barriers and harms of a dangerous and costly immigration process to suggest that something as simple as passing this test, which in and of itself can be difficult, is all folks need to do. Um, Whereas we know that in reality, passing the naturalization test is just one part of a very long and difficult process. But students will be subjected to that in the coming year. Um, okay. Abortion access. This fight is one that is something not unfamiliar to people who follow the Oklahoma legislature. Though I think that it is fair to say that we saw a larger than usual volume of bills attacking access to abortion care this year, and that we also saw more of those heard than usual. So some of the things that may have gotten sort of weeded out in committee before passed and are now law. Um, so these include things like trap laws, House Bill 1904, which says that only folks who are certified OBGYNs can provide abortion care. Um, Bills that sort of create arbitrary timelines to try to limit access, like House Bill 2441. We also saw Senate Bill 918, which has been sort of a bill several years in the making, passed, which is a so-called trigger ban, which means that in the instance that Roe v. Wade is sort of challenged by the courts, that any piece of that is overturned, that would immediately sort of trigger loss of access to care in the state of Oklahoma. Um, we also saw some additional sort of new tactics in this space, um, but a lot of them rely on the same broader concepts, things that are targeted restrictions on abortion providers that make it more difficult, unnecessarily so, for people to access care. We saw those pass in Senate Bill 778 and Senate Bill 779. Um, and also saw sort of criminalization used as a response. So things like House Bill 1102, which is a clearly unconstitutional measure criminalizing abortion care providers, passed. So lots moved in volume in this space, um, and lots to, I think, watch out for as we think about next session and the new tactics that they may try to use to sort of further this very political attack on abortion care. As we dig into the criminal legal system, um, we're oftentimes talking in this space about um, sort of, quote unquote, good bills, things that we are hopeful about. But this is a bit of mixed bag, and both of some of the bad bills that we have disrupted for the time being, but that we're keeping an eye on, and some of the bills that we were hopeful about that didn't make it quite as far as we would have liked them to. Um, I think for folks who've been following the legislature for any number of years, it's no surprise that there were bills introduced to try to roll back pieces of State Question 780. We've seen that every single year since the state question passed, even before it was actually enacted. Um, this year, we saw Senate Bill 670 and Senate Bill 814, both of which sort of attack people using drugs and try to recriminalize pieces of that introduced. Um, they are both dormant, so they didn't make it very far in the process, but are things we're keeping an eye on as that tactic is used. And then the bill that made it further, modeled after legislation that we also sort of saw move pretty far during the 2020 session, is Senate Bill 334. Um, this bill looks to double the amount of time over which the felony theft threshold can be aggregated. Um, Really just undoing the felony theft threshold sort of changes of State Question 780 by making sure that amount is applied over such a time that it's almost no longer relevant, that we're just sort of further criminalizing poverty in the state of Oklahoma. And that made it as far as conference committee. So where it had just a kind of final stages left, one final vote in each chamber before it just went dormant because it wasn't heard. And so I think that that's one especially that we are keeping an eye on as we look towards next legislative session. In some of the bills that we were hopeful about that didn't get as far as we would have liked, House Bill 2320, which is a concept that you've heard us talk about a lot as an ACLU of Oklahoma affiliate over the last several years. A bill that sort of originally sought to bifurcate the verdict and sentencing stages of every jury trial and allow jurors a full range of sentencing options. Made it through the House with some amendments, and ultimately was not heard in the Senate Judiciary Committee, which has been sort of a roadblock for us before. And so really paying attention to and engaging that Senate Judiciary Committee is going to be a key piece of our continuing work as we seek to try to pass reform legislation like House Bill 2320, which will be eligible to be heard again next year. We also saw movement sort of in response to State Question 805 of Senate Bill 704, which was a very modest version of what had been in the state question that sort of seeks to start to rid our system of these failed tough on crime era repeat sentence penalties, which result in Oklahomans spending much more time in prison for the same charge than people in any other state in the country. It was passed out of Senate Public Safety, so that very first step in its legislative process, but it was double assigned to an appropriations committee as well, where it wasn't heard. So this has no shortage of hurdles still ahead of it. But for folks who were engaged on State Question 805 and want to see the harms of those repeat sentence penalties ended, this legislation is also eligible to still move in the 2022 session. Finally, it would not be a complete review unless we talked about House Bill 1775, the bill that became the critical race theory bill. So like others, it was shucked in a kind of a final stage. It moved through the House as a bill that sought to implement some protocol related to concussions in schools and school sports. And in the Senate Education Committee, it became a bill that instead limits the speech of educators and school officials and really just chills courses that have anything to do with racism, gender discrimination, or lived equality by really kind of inserting this language about divisive concepts and conversations that could make students or educators uncomfortable. This passed on party lines in both chambers with an emergency. And so we are already seeing some of those effects as schools try to determine what is or is not addressed in this bill. Because while it's being talked about as a critical race theory bill, we know that it goes sort of far beyond just what critical race theory is in terms of what it prohibits. And so that is one of the pieces of legislation that we are seeing some in real time impacts of as we work to figure out how we fight that next, given that it is signed into law. On that note, in the sort of what's next phase of this, there are a few things that we can still do, that we can actively do in response to bad bills that passed, in an effort to pass some of the reforms we're hopeful to see in the future, and in an effort to try to stop some of the bad things that are still sort of in the pipeline. Those include having discussions with your legislators about interim studies. As we go into the fall, sort of over the summer, legislators can file these requests for interim studies. They can put together these panels of experts to talk about subject matter that is important to us as constituents and that really thinks about what kind of legislation they hope to file. Um, and I would encourage folks who are interested to have those conversations with your elected officials, ask what sort of interim studies they're already planning or requesting, making asks if you have things that you hope to see discussed sort of in that space ahead of next session. We know for sure that we will see a redistricting special session likely in October. So while we did see legislation pass that sort of created rough drafts of legislative districts, members of the House and Senate did not have access to census data that had been updated sort of because of the delay in that due to COVID. So they will come back in October. They do have to draw congressional boundaries at that time, but they also should very much revisit the state legislative districts that they drew. And we should be engaged in that process and encouraging them to make sure that those districts are as equitable as possible. Another big piece of our what's next is looking at possible legislation for next year, and that includes the Attorney General's Reclassification Council, which we have been following along for the 2+ years that it has been around. It was created in legislation to create a felony class system. It is supposed to either hold the prison population neutral or reduce it. And right now, the proposal would put a lot more folks in Oklahoma prisons and keep them there for longer. So we are really going to keep an eye on what's happening as that potentially becomes sort of makes a shift from a proposal from that committee to a bill. It is a great time to think about in district meetings too. Your elected officials are at home a little bit more. They aren't up in Oklahoma City several days a week at the Capitol. So it's a great time to try to schedule an opportunity to chat with them about the session, to get their debriefs, to talk about issues you are interested in. And we are very happy to help talk sort of about that format as that's something you are interested in exploring in your district. We are also in a moment where we are seeing sort of two of the responses to what's next. A little bit of that is talking about litigation and what options exist there ahead of most of these bills going into effect November 1st. Another tactic we're seeing sort of employed here is initiative petition efforts. So things like House Bill 1674 now has a petition, which would be State Question 816. So they're seeking signatures to put that on the ballot for Oklahomans to have the final say in whether or not that hit and kill AntiFreedom Bill that passed actually stands as law. And all of that happens as we look towards a 2022 session, where we know that oftentimes in an election year, legislators are passing even more partisan political bills than they do in odd years. And given what we saw this session, the idea of that happening at any greater volume can seem daunting. So those are sort of all of the things that exist on our what's next plate. And I know that that was a whole lot of me talking at you. So I am happy to answer questions as we have them, and we'll also bring Tamaya back in to plug into helping us wrap up.
Yeah. So thank you, Nicole. Appreciate your work on this. We did have a few questions. One question when asking about when you were talking about some of our wins, we did have a question about if you could tell us what kind of the critical harm reduction is and tell us a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, so the bill in particular that passed, the harm reduction bill this year, dealt with needle exchanges, making sure that folks on the ground doing harm reduction work, normally relative to populations that use drugs, can make sure that folks have access to clean needles. So some of the the steps towards making drug use as safe as possible, knowing that sort of cutting out drug use completely is not a realistic sort of next step in health and safety for everyone. And so um, the bill that passed there just decriminalized that needle exchange to make sure that people could safely do that work on the ground and do so without facing penalties for engaging in harm reduction. And I think that those conversations will very much continue, as there are many other sort of harm reduction strategies that could be employed if they were sort of allowed by law.
Yeah. Thank you, Nicole. We have another question that says, what are our plans around bail? What have we done, and kind of what could we do around bail?
Yeah, we have had lots of conversations about our pretrial system, about pretrial detention and money bail in particular. For folks who followed along, we saw sort of a big legislative push around that in 2019 with Senate Bill 252, and also saw in 2019 and 2020 legislation move in the form of House Bill 2019 that dealt with sort of pretrial detention relative to primary caretakers especially, and ultimately saw those bills in both chambers kind of get to that final step and then fail by a margin of sort of very slim votes. So this year, I think a lot of the conversation was sort of reconvening around what that looked like and what the needs were for reform. But it is very much my hope that we will see some interim studies around the pretrial system and money bail as we look into the 2022 session, and that we will also see some legislation introduced that makes some really substantive attempts to address some of the barriers to release for so many Oklahomans. And we know it's one that we can't do sort of through legislation alone, that policy and legislation is one tactic, that we hope to have some meaningful conversations and see some meaningful legislation move, but that we're also sort of engaged around conversations happening at county levels where people are looking at jail populations and what reduction options are, and in things like the ongoing litigation that the ACLU of Oklahoma has in Canadian County.
Yeah. Thank you, Nicole. We do have another question. Amy wants to know any suggestions on how to avoid burnout as we try to encourage our elected officials to do the right thing when we know they do not have the best interests of Oklahomans in mind. And if you don't mind, I'd like to take a stab at this real quick, and then definitely want you to you jump in. And I think that's a great question. I think it's a question that we try to deal with regularly. But as well, if anyone else has any answers to suggestions, please put in the chat or in the comment section on our Facebook Live. But I think the way we avoid burnout is by recognizing that it's just a bigger mission than us individually. That it is, a lot of us feel we have a duty and an obligation to fight as hard as we can around just making Oklahoma a better place and moving Oklahoma forward. And we are able to avoid burnout because we know there's a higher there's a higher mission for us. However, I think burnout is super real in our work. And the one things that we have to recognize is that part of the mission and part of the fight is sometimes stepping back and, giving ourselves the permission and opportunity, and giving each other the permission and opportunity to step back when need be, to take a breath, to do the other things that fulfill us. Because it does no good for the mission if we don't have the energy and capacity to do it. So like you said, many of us have been doing this work for so long that it just feels like we've been doing it for so long, we haven't seen progress. But once we step back and realize and talk to folks, we do know that progress has been made. It may not happen as fast as we want it, but it's definitely happening. So to avoid burnout is simply by stepping back and removing ourselves when we need to, when we recognize it. I will also say, that yes, a lot of the times it feels like our elected officials don't have the best interests of Oklahoma in mind, but that doesn't mean that we don't still hold them accountable. All elected officials, whether friends or foes, and we also recognize that sometimes our friends can turn into our foes, and the other way around, that they all are, we still must hold them all accountable to the people. And we are able to do that through talking to them. We're able to do that through litigation sometimes. But we definitely feel that's part of the mission of protecting liberties, to protecting civil liberties, is hold each and every elected official accountable. Nicole, I'd love to hear if you had any thoughts on how we do that.
Yeah, I think that that is a good question, and one that it is always good to think about in advance ahead of when we get to that point where we feel burnt out. I think for me, part of it is remembering in those moments where I feel close to burnout that I'm doing this in community, and to surround myself with those folks who are also doing that work. Like, find the people you can call, the organizational meetings that you can plug into, where you can remember that you aren't alone in this. Um, for me, it is also important, because so much of our work is defensive, right? A lot of the times we're thinking about trying to stop harms, to engage in some spaces where I'm thinking about what we can build. So it's finding the ways to have conversations. And I think about like our framework for this session where we had no new fines, no new crimes conversations. And that was a way that broadly we could create a framework for legislators to have a little bit more of a grasp on the ways that things, even when they might sound good, could have unintended sort of harms because they were either a fine or a criminalization response. And we didn't see everyone, even folks who we may think are friendly, vote uh, that way all of the time. But we were able to have more conversations and able to sort of see people think through, is this criminalizing someone? Is this a fine? And does that actually sort of meet the needs of what we're trying to stop here with this law? So I think thinking about the building and thinking about the long-term conversations, is helpful to me in thinking about how I disrupt some of that short-term burnout of the sort of day-to-day fights that we're in.
Yeah. No, I think that's such a great point. And Nicole, you've said something that stays with me often, and I'm probably going to mess it up. So make sure that I say it right. But we also have to realize that we don't really have permanent wins and permanent friends, just permanent issues. And I think that's been really helpful. That if anything, this session has taught us that, no victory, whether this amazing criminal justice work that the ACLU has done for so long, could be overturned with simple legislation. Or even where my passion is around reproductive rights, where we saw some just a few years ago where had numerous years. We had 3 years where we did not have any anti-abortion bills become law. To see where we are now, where we've had the most in such a long time, that we have to, sometimes victories are not permanent, but the work and the issues that we are working with are. So we have to really focus on that. Any last thing you really want to say before we kind of move from there?
I would just really say, like, thank you so much to everybody who took time to engage with us throughout this legislative session. I know that being remote does allow us some great opportunities for more virtual access sometimes, but it also can make it feel a lot harder and lonelier. I think that we really saw the impact of legislators not regularly being sort of in spaces with constituents and with the people that they were harming with these bills, um, in their ability to sort of move more of them. But every call and email that you made absolutely made a difference, because as many bills as we talked about, there were so many more that we disrupted, right? That we made sure didn't have a path to victory. And it can feel hard to celebrate that in the face of so much bad legislation that did move. But it really is absolutely sort of a harm reduction win, right? We kept our communities safer by making sure that legislators couldn't do all of the harmful things that they wanted to this session. And so just thank you so much to everyone who tuned in today, but also who joined us throughout this session in any of the actions to make sure that we were pushing for conversations in the direction that we hope to see the legislature build, and also stopping a lot of harmful bills in the process.
Yeah, thank you so much. Again, yes, thank you to all who joined today and who's been working with us. And we also know that, session is very limited. It's a few months, but the real work happens when they're not in session. And we still have a lot of work to do, and encourage you to join with us in that work throughout when session's not in. I'd like to kick it to Cassidy real quick so he can tell us a little bit about what's upcoming and ways that you can get involved with ACLU in the next few months. So Cassidy, go ahead.
Hey everyone, thanks again for attending today's webinar. I just want to quickly say in the chat, I'm sending out, if you are not a part of our text rapid response team, there's a quick link in the chat for you to fill out the form and become a member of that team. That team regularly gets asked to make calls and outreach to their legislators. The team was very influential to a lot of the stuff that we did this past legislative session. And so I want to send a big thank you to everybody who participated as a rapid response text team member. But like we've heard, we'll continue to do the work, and there's lots to be done. So please join that team if you get a chance. The other thing I just want to throw out there, as we're in the middle of June and Pride Month, we will be marching in the OKC Pride Alliance's march on June 25th at, it starts at 10. Oh, sorry, June 26th, Saturday, June 26th. And so following today's program, I will send a copy video link for everybody who attended if they want a chance to refer back to what we've talked about today. And I will also include a link to join us in the march at the parade. So be on the lookout for that. And then we'll just continue to send emails and keep you guys informed on everything that we're doing. Follow our social media for quick updates on everything that's going on.
Thank you, Cassidy. And again, please consider joining our rapid response team. They're very helpful when needed during session. And with that said, of course, we want to make sure, like, if you can, would love for you to continue to support our work. There are the ways that you can donate to the ACLU of Oklahoma, as well as the foundation are in the chat as well. And any and all donations are so, we are so grateful and really help continue our work. So with that said, I want to wish everyone a happy Juneteenth, a happy Pride Month. Please connect with us how you can. And most importantly, please don't ever hesitate to reach out to anyone, any one of us here at the ACLU of Oklahoma team to see how we can be of help and assistance to you. So with that, I will let everyone get back to the rest of their day. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good rest of your day and weekend.